Hello, my name is Morgan Meadows. Today I will be presenting the servant leadership theory for the Leadership in Higher Education course at Grace College. Let's begin by looking at the overview of today's presentation. We'll begin by discussing the origins of the servant leadership theory, some definitions of servant leadership and the servant leader, two categories for defining or identifying servant leaders, an application to organizational leadership, its application to effecting change, its application to higher education, and finally, a call to research. Origins. History of the servant leadership theory. Modern literature attributes the theory of servant leadership to Robert K. Greenleaf. Greenleaf hails from Terre Haute, Indiana, a fellow Hoosier, and was born in 1904. He first studied at the Rose Polytechnic Institute, now the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, and later transferred to Carleton College in Minnesota, where he would graduate. Greenleaf worked for 40 years as a research manager for AT&T and also provided consulting work for several large corporations over the years. It was his professional experiences in corporate America that inspired his new leadership theory. It was his 40 years of research on corporate America that led him to seek out a more effective leadership alternative. Greenleaf wrote about a leadership crisis that was occurring in America during his time. The leadership crisis, according to Greenleaf, was sparked by widespread selfish motives and a lack of values among organizational leaders. Greenleaf wanted to steer America away from traditional authoritarian leadership styles and reform the leadership scene. The idea of servant leadership came to Greenleaf after reading Hesse's Journey to the East, a mythological story of a group of individuals who embark on a spiritual journey. The group is accompanied by a servant named Leo who disappears. In his absence, the group realizes they were being led by the servant the whole time. Greenleaf concluded that great leaders are first servants. As Spears comments after reading the story, Greenleaf concluded that its central meaning was that the great leader is first experienced as a servant to others. Greenleaf wrote about his theory in a 1970 essay called The Servant as Leader. He would go on to write many more essays, articles, and books that expounded on his idea. Greenleaf later went on to found the Center for Applied Ethics, now the Robert K. Greenleaf Center in Indianapolis, Indiana. Some leadership theorists, such as Sinjai and Saros of Monash University in Australia, disagree that Greenleaf coined servant leadership. The two argue that the theory has been practiced for centuries and was first introduced by the Christian Jesus Christ. As appealing and refreshing as Greenleaf's conceptualization of servant leadership is, Greenleaf is not the individual who first introduced the notion of servant leadership to everyday human endeavor. It was Christianity's founder, Jesus Christ, who first taught the concept, 2002. In Mark 10, Jesus explains that the Gentiles utilize authoritarian leadership styles, but that Christians should be servants. Jesus explains that the chief will be the one who first serves everyone. And again in John 13, Jesus is seen girding himself with a towel and washing the disciples' feet. This task was only reserved for lowest of servants. Jesus was showcasing his servant leadership model and teaching a very practical application. Though theorists don't seem to agree on the founder of the theory, the foundations of the theory are the same on all sides. Now let's look at some definitions of a servant leader. What exactly is servant leadership? According to Robert K. Greenleaf, the servant leader is servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first, perhaps because of the need to assuage an unusual power drive or to acquire material possessions. 1977. Hale and Fields state that servant leadership takes place when leaders assume the position of servant in their relationships with fellow workers. And that's Russell and Stone. Hale and Fields state that servant leadership is an understanding and practice of leadership that places the good of those led over the self-interest of the leader, emphasizing leader behaviors that focus on follower development and de-emphasizing glorification of the leaders. 2007. Patterson writes that servant leaders are those who serve with a focus on the followers, whereby the followers are the primary concern and the organizational concerns are peripheral. The servant leader constructs our virtues, which are defined as the good moral quality in a person, or the general quality of goodness or moral excellence. 2003. Finally, Don Page and Paul Wong concur that a servant leader may be defined as a leader whose primary purpose for leading is to serve others by investing in their development and well-being for the benefit of accomplishing tasks and goals for the common good. Looking at it from this perspective, some might argue that servant leadership is simply a rendition of transformational leadership. According to Page and Wong, servant leadership is an attitude toward the responsibilities of leadership as much as it is a style of leadership. 2000. Leadership theorists tend to identify servant leaders two different ways. Let's look at both distinguishing categories. Some authors tend to classify servant leaders by their intentions. Why are they leading? According to these authors, the servant leader is one who simply serves until he is promoted to leader by those he has served. Sometimes the servant is never promoted, but is only leader by means of pragmatism. This example is seen in Hesse's Journey to the East. The group doesn't realize Leo is the leader until he is gone, and everything goes awry. Other authors such as Robert Russell, identify the servant leader by his displayed values. According to Russell, only leaders of highest morality can be identified as servant leaders. To Russell, leadership in itself is amoral. Only people can be moral or immoral. Thus, the leader is either moral or immoral. Russell points out that the servant leader is always moral. You'll notice that the criteria for identifying a servant leader is all abstract. There are not concrete ways for measuring intention and values. This is why servant leadership studies remain mostly philosophical. Next, let's look at servant leadership's application to organizational leadership. As you can infer from the definitions of servant leadership, this theory focuses on individuals and not necessarily organizations. However, the individual leader can effectively practice servant leadership in his respected organization. The reason servant leadership does not directly apply to organizations is because it cannot be forced. It is impossible for an administrator to say, from now on, every leader in this company will be servant leaders. Rather, the servant leader attracts attention to his style and others simply catch on. Southwest Airlines and the Men's Warehouse have successfully seen servant leadership turn into an organization-wide movement. As Greenleaf points out, servant leadership stands in direct opposition to authoritarian leadership models. The servant leader never takes or demands influence. He gradually earns influence by serving those around him. As Greenleaf states in relation to the leadership crisis, a fresh critical look is being taken at the issues of power and authority, and people are beginning to learn, however haltingly, to relate to one another in less coercive and more creatively supporting ways. One of the most obvious ways a servant leadership gains influence is by building trust. When trust is built between the servant leader and those around him, they will have an easier time following him. Rather, they will want to follow him. The servant leader never coerces power. As Russell and Stone point out, in the absence of trust, fear dominates. 2002. Servant leaders build trust through visibility. That is, constantly being seen by interacting with colleagues above and below. In other words, the servant leader must give followers the chance to get to know him on a more intimate level. According to Robert Russell, visibility is the public presence, behavior, and interactions of leaders with their followers. Joseph and Winston call this interaction social exchange and point out the correlation between social exchange and the level of trust between leaders and followers. The servant leader is always aware of his own humanity. He interacts with others in a way that lets them know the leader is a person, just like the servant leader impacts his organization through modeling. He becomes a living, breathing, walking, talking display of the vision, goals, and values he is trying to promote in his organization. He doesn't make commands for these things to be followed, but others gradually catch on as they see them practically applied by the leader himself. Application to organizational change. How do servant leaders affect change? Servant leaders, unlike other types of leaders, are hesitant to make waves. They don't have the propensity to upset the status quo. They are not pushy and do not behave irrationally in situations of conflict that may demand change. Servant leaders create change gently and gradually. As seen in almost all servant leadership literature today, servant leaders are others focused. They have a genuine concern for others around them. They recognize the intrinsic value of each person in the organization, not just the value the person brings to the company. Organizational change always affects individuals because it is individuals that comprise the organization in need of change. As India Lane points out, for the individual, change of any type creates a sense of loss for the past and a sense of anxiety for the future. Thus, the servant leader affects change with individuals in mind. He or she recognizes in the beginning of the change process that there are important and delicate individuals at stake. As already discussed, the servant leader begins the change process by building trust within the organization. Again, trust is built through visibility and social interactions with those around him. As the leader builds trust, he gains influence. When followers trust their leader, there is less fear and anxiety, as Lane talks about, and the change process becomes less painful. Second, the servant leader constructs a vision. Though the servant leader must be a visionary, capable of seeing where the organization needs to be and where it currently is, the vision will not solely belong to himself. The leader will develop his vision with the goals, desires, and interests of others in mind. As Spears points out, the servant leader is effective at building consensus within groups. His vision is simply an articulation of what the individuals within the organization need. Finally, the servant leader promotes his collaborative vision by modeling and persuasion. He acts out the vision in front of his followers every day and spends time addressing the pros of pursuing the vision. The servant leader makes his followers want to go after the vision. There is no unique formula for the servant leader, although persuasion and example are preferred methods. If she promotes her vision through persuasion and example, there is less likelihood that an evil vision will prevail. Whetstone, 2002. It's important to note that though servant leadership deals with the individual leader, its methods should cater to all members of the leader's organization, not just those underneath. The servant leader must serve his fellows that are above him and below him. Why? Because often the leader must gain influence with those above him in order to be able to initiate the change process. Finally, servant leaders' application to higher education. Servant leaders in colleges and universities. First, let's realize that servant leadership can be practiced by all within a university, not just upper level administration. Servanthood is not just reserved for those already on top, but also for those on the bottom. Servant leadership, when it becomes a successful movement, will even leak out, and servant leaders will emerge from among the student body. Ideally, the leadership style will become a part of the university's culture. Here's an example of a university administrator who inspired servant leadership among the student body through modeling. Before accepting the position of president at one of the South's top-ranked private universities, this specific PhD walked around campus and introduced himself to passing students. Hello, I'm Ben. He let the students know that he was not just another hotshot doctor with a takeover mentality, but he was a person just like them. The administrator gained influence with the student body before an official title was ever bestowed upon him. His bold statement caught on and is now visible throughout the entire university. This kind of behavior from a servant leader in higher ed can help break down long-standing barriers between students and faculty. Students will feel that the administration is more relatable and is concerned about their well-being, which of course is the mission for any college or university. This lack of barriers will lead to healthy conversation between both parties. As students, faculty, and administration interact, the administration will be able to form a clearer vision of where the university should be headed. Colleges and universities are the perfect environments for successful servant leadership. Every day, the servant leader has the opportunity to model his leadership style in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of emerging leaders. In his 1977 book, Greenleaf points out that American higher education was creating analysts and not artists. He meant that the American higher education system was producing people who knew how to critique and analyze problems, but lacked the creativity and vision needed to bring about change. With education that is preponderantly abstract and analytical, it is no wonder that there is a preoccupation with criticism and that not much thought is given to what can I do about it. 1977. The danger, perhaps, is to hear the analyst too much and the artist too little. According to Greenleaf, the servant leader is an artist who is creatively supportive. He also trains other artists. In this regard, the higher education scene has the potential to become what Greenleaf might call a servant leadership art academy. Servant leadership has the potential to remedy some of higher education's most perplexing issues. One such issue is what India Lane refers to as isolationism. The true servant leader creates positive relationships with individuals in every vein of the respected university. This behavior destroys walls between sectors and departments and sparks conversation. This destruction of isolationism helps the servant leader create formal or informal coalitions of change, that is, groups of individuals who seek change together. A call to research, taking servant leadership from theory to model. Many researchers are hesitant to label servant leadership as a model, but prefer the term theory. This is because it is mostly philosophical and, due to its abstract nature, cannot easily be measured. As Russell and Stone point out, unfortunately, most of the servant leadership literature is philosophical. Consequently, the theory lacks sufficient scientific evidence to justify its widespread acceptance at this point in time. However, there has been some research attempting to identify the connection between servant leadership and organizational success. Researchers such as Page and Wong, Dennis and Bocarnia, and Joseph and Winston have seen favorable results with this endeavor. In the future, researchers should define the traits, characteristics, and behaviors of genuine servant leaders through empirical research. But is this possible? Can servant leaders be defined? It seems that a servant leader, marked by humility, would be reluctant to sign his name on a form that says, "Hey, I'm a servant leader." One of the traits of a servant leader is that they don't necessarily see themselves as leaders, but servants. This kind of research seems paradoxical. However, researchers should take the next step of analyzing the impact of servant leadership on organizations. In conclusion, servant leadership has been practiced for centuries and was put into words by the Christian Jesus. Robert Greenleaf coined servant leadership as a servant leadership theory in 1970. The servant leader is an individual who aspires to serve and ultimately becomes a leader as influence is earned. Servant leaders can be identified by both their intentions and values or behaviors. Servant leadership starts with an individual, but has the potential to become a movement that affects the entire organization. And finally, the servant leader effects change gently and gradually and persuades followers by means. Higher education is the perfect environment for fruitful servant leadership as higher education leaders work to model its tenets to students. Servant leadership provides remedies for some of higher education's toughest issues, such as isolationism. Little scientific research has been done due to the abstractness of servant leadership's basic tenets. However, research should be done to measure the correlation between servant leadership and organizational success. This has been a presentation of servant leadership presented by Morgan Meadows, Grace College, February 2018.